Hello everyone, salam, namaste, adab, welcome to today's event. Today we are going to hear Professor Ashoka Mody on India is broken. It is a topic which really is very challenging. I remember his interview with Barkhadat, where Barkhadat asked one question, which I'm also asking. How come a country so important these days with $1 trillion plus economy and seems to be so powerful that every nation, big nation, lining up for India, how that country can be broken? So it will be very interesting to hear Ashoka Mody Sahab, who is an economic historian at Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. And he has worked at the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. So obviously he knows all the economics and how it is playing in India. The introductory remarks will be given by another economist, Shrayana Bhattacharya, who unfortunately is not present at the moment, but she has sent a video to play for introductory remarks because her father is suddenly very sick and she has to take care of him. And the concluding remarks will be given by Dr. Abu Saleh Sharif. Here, my apologies for his misspelling him as Shareif. Rather, he should be Shariff. Dr. Abu Saleh Sharif is a well-known economist in India, more famously known for Sachar Commission as Executive Secretary. And presently, he is here in DC area as President of Center for, Chief of Scholar at the US India Policy, Washington, DC, as well as President of Center for Research and Debate in Development, New Delhi. And he was former Chief Economist at National Council of Applied Economics Research, New Delhi. So let's listen to introductory remark by Shrayana Bhattacharya, please.
Good evening from Delhi, and I suppose good morning to all of you in DC and the East Coast.
Hear the voice?
First, I'm really sorry I couldn't be there with all of you to join the presentation and the discussions. I look forward to hearing and watching them on the YouTube channel when the recording is up and available. I have an exigency at home, and that prevents me from joining you this morning. I didn't still want to miss my chance to introduce the book and actually hope that Professor Mody and all of you in your discussions perhaps think a bit more carefully about one question that I'd like to raise in the context of many of the themes that the book brings up. But before that, I do want to thank Professor Mody for putting this book out there. I think it's a very important set of questions that he lays out about the way the social contract, in fact, in India seems to have failed many of its people. Many of us may disagree with some parts of the thesis and agree with others. And I think it'll make for a very rich discussion today as he talks you through what he's discussing and elaborating on in the book. I think the second reason I'd really like to thank him for the book is it's always helpful to have long-term, longitudinal information on the economy, looking at the trends and how they've played out through several decades. It's always helpful to have this important historical record. So I think just as a worker also economic history and how economic policy making has evolved, I just like to thank him for all the work in the book and all the information that's available in the book. I found it extremely helpful from that perspective. With that, I also want to quickly thank Razi and everyone in the organizing team. And I'll use my privileges now as I'm setting up the conversation to perhaps suggest that all of you think about one particular question as Professor Mody lays out his arguments, and that is the question of gender. Despite India growing rapidly at a period of time, female employment rates have stayed fairly low. There are very stubborn gaps between male employment and female employment rates, and this holds irrespective of which data set you use. It could be private data collected by CMIE. It could also be the government's own periodic labor force data. And not only are these gaps stubborn, we've seen rural employment rates for women go up in the past 3 or 4 years, and many economists feel it's because of distress following the pandemic. But urban employment rates, even amongst educated elite women, stay in, barely the lower double digits. And given that world, one of the key questions that I would like all of you to think about, perhaps, and even for Professor Mody to react to, is why do we see economic policy making just failing women and women's needs consistently? We are a country where men rank in the bottom 5 of the world when it comes to performing care work, and women are working constantly, and yet most of their labors remain unpaid. 66% of women's labor is unpaid relative to 11% for men. And given these gaps in valuing women's time, valuing women's energies, trying to actually think about factor market reform that can support women, it really opens up a question of why is it that we have such a masculine approach to thinking about the economy and the way economic contracts and reforms are thought through. We've had some very important shifts that have helped women, particularly girl children, be it the education programs, be it the midday meal schemes, there's a public distribution system, many welfare programs that have tried to at least include more women and help their nutrition and education outcomes. And yet we see that many of those investments don't eventually translate into women holding on to jobs and doing well in the paid economy, partly because of norms and partly because many of the other factor markets just don't seem to work very well for women. So I'll leave you perhaps with this provocation, which is why is it that when we think of the economy, I recently wrote a book and I call the Indian economy a boys' club economy. Why is it that we're still in this world that women's labors continue to be undervalued, discounted, and women really struggle to hold down to independent livelihoods? Why is it, I would argue that perhaps the Indian economy has not really failed its promise when it comes to certain groups of men with opportunity, but it seems to have really failed its women writ large. And I'll leave you with that provocation, and I'm sure Professor Mody will hopefully respond to some of these questions as he lays out his arguments. And I wish you a wonderful set of deliberations, and I apologize again that I can't join you in person. Over to Professor Mody. Thank you.
Thank you. And Professor Mody, yeah, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Razi, for having me, and thank you very much to Sharanya also for her very thoughtful introduction. I think she can be reassured that the theme of gender is very much central to what I am going to talk about. So you see on your screen 2 different covers of my book. And the left-hand side cover is of the India edition, and the right hand is the Stanford US International edition. And right off the bat, I would like to point out that I depart from the usual convention of using GDP growth as a metric of economic progress and economic welfare. There are well-known problems with GDP growth in this regard, not the least of which is that GDP growth can be highly unequal, and moreover, therefore, it does not reflect the lived reality of people. GDP growth also has a problem that you can ravage the environment and get GDP growth, but then you take away the inheritance of your children. So throughout, I have focused on what I call the elusive search for jobs. Jobs is the one thread that holds my book together, right from the beginning to the end. So let me show you why jobs are so important. This is a clip from a movie, Shri 420, 1954. And a feature of my book is that I draw a lot from movies because they have a contemporary commentary that sometimes is missing in the statistics as well as in the media.
धंधा यानी कि काम ना काम कामी की तलाश में तो मैं इलाहाबाद से यहाँ चल कर आया हूँ। क्यों भाई, तुम्हारे शहर में पेट भरने के लिए क्या करना चाहिए? जो मैं करता हूँ, भीख मांगनी चाहिए। नहीं, कोई काम बताओ मुझे, काम बताओ। तो सोचना पड़ेगा।
So I fast forward 44 years, 1998, another iconic movie, Satya, another migrant into Bombay, the same question.
कुछ काम मिलेगा? कुछ भी चलेगा तेरे को?
So this is the central question I ask myself. And why, despite this very bullish and sometimes giddy view on India, why does it keep failing to generate jobs? And why are jobs such a emotional as well as living restraint on people? And my answer is twofold. One is that India keeps losing the Red Queen race, which a phrase I use to describe how other countries keep going ahead of India. And the reason behind that is that despite all the glamour of Silicon Valley executives, Indian Silicon Valley executives, India does not invest in human capital, and it does not treat its women well. So this comes to Sharanya's point. This is a very central theme of the book. And these twin features of human capital and treating women well, especially by bringing them into the workforce, these, I argue in the book, are essential prerequisites of long-term economic progress. No country in the last 350 years has made progress without these two attributes. So let's look at the Red Queen race. This is a chart which is the share of global manufactured exports. You will see that in 1948, India is the black line. India was in fact slightly ahead of Japan. It's slightly misleading because Japan was coming out of the war, was a very disrupted economy. Japan was already a industrialized nation by the 1920s, and not surprisingly went rapidly ahead of India very quickly. But then India lost the Red Queen race to Korea, to Taiwan, and finally to the behemoth China. And that is a race that is, having lost to China, Indians have always been very self-conscious of that fact. And there's been some view that India will somehow substitute for China at some point in time. But if you look at these numbers again carefully, you will see that from about 2010, the Indian share of global manufactured exports has remained flat, whereas Vietnam, a country of 100 million people, has come from below and in 2020 has caught up with India. Just to restate that point, Vietnamese exports of manufactured goods are the same as Indian exports of manufactured goods. Bangladesh is still a limited force in the global arena. It is a much bigger force in garments. Bangladesh exports more garments and has exported more garments than India since the last about 10 years, but is not yet a broad-based economy in the same way as Vietnam is. What lies behind this failure? What lies behind the Indian failure to export manufactured goods? There's a lazy answer which many Indian economists use when they point to some so-called labor laws. But the real answer is when my presentation stuck? There it is. Okay. Twofold answer. Primary education, female primary education. You will see over here the sequence: Taiwan, Korea, China. Each of these countries that educated their girls early went ahead of India early. It is true now that Indian girls are almost 100% in primary school. But there is a problem with the quality of education. So you see on this, these are charts from surveys that measure the comprehension and skills of children in schools. Reading. 5th grade kids still struggle to read 2nd grade level text. In fact, less than 50% are able to do so. 5th grade kids struggle to do division. The point being, the phrase "the Red Queen race" means you have to run faster than you can to catch up with everybody else, because the world is not standing still. Compare over here, for example, Vietnam. This is an international skills measurement test, the so-called PISA, conducted by the OECD. There is some controversy about this data in the sense that some people believe that Vietnamese performance here is overstated. Others believe that it is fair. But whichever way you see, the performance here is so outstanding that even if it needs to be depreciated a little bit, it is still very good. So Vietnamese kids in this test did better than French kids in science, about the same as French kids in mathematics. And if you look at the right-hand side panel, the share of low performers was relatively low, which means that education is also relatively equitable. So the education is one central feature of long-term economic development, especially industrialization, especially manufactured trade. The other element is female labor force participation. Again, you see over here that the East Asian countries that have gone ahead of India have relatively high female labor force participation rate. India was always low and has come down since the mid-2000s. Bangladesh, which was even lower than India, has gone up. Sharanya asked a very important question. Why is female labor force participation in India so low? There are multiple answers. At approximate level, the answer is simple, that the share of female labor force participation declined in agriculture sometime in the 2000s because agricultural mechanization became more prevalent, doing women out of a job. Many of their husbands went to the cities, and the culture of working alongside husbands or in the presence of husbands as chaperones meant that many of them withdrew from the labor force. The other side, on the urban side, as she pointed out, the labor force participation is even lower. And in my view, that's essentially because of relatively high levels of urban violence against women. Again, there is some controversy on whether the level of violence has increased over time. Some data tends to show that. Nevertheless, it is high enough given the norms to prevent women from working. But overall, as the Bangladeshi example shows, that if you create jobs, such as in the garment sector, then women will in fact go and work. You see over here a fundamental problem is that the lack of jobs diminishes the opportunities for women, which then reinforces old prejudices and violence, which then keeps in India in this low-level equilibrium. There is a very great temptation, almost a seduction today, that technology will somehow solve India's problems. It's very widespread. And I'm going to give you one example, which is a very particularly important example. Is it possible that computer-assisted teaching will somehow raise the level of education in India? The fellow you see in front of you, his name is Sal Khan. Sal Khan is the world's most important practitioner of online learning. He does so through something called Khan Academy. So listen to what Sal Khan has to say about technology.
When Khan Academy is used best, it's used inside of a classroom with people next to each other. Students are able to work at their own pace on things that are relevant to them. The teacher is able to walk around and have more personal one-on-one interaction, actually more human-to-human interaction than they would get in a traditional lecture-based classroom.
So notice here Sal Khan's message that human-to-human interaction is central. And the notion that technology can somehow do away with human development and human interaction is both misleading and in a sense almost a callous view of how to go forward. Let me just point out two areas in which India has been relatively successful. On the left, you see what is conventionally known as software exports, but is in effect computer and information services. At the start of the millennium, India did particularly well in this segment, rising to almost a 25% share by about 2007. That share has come down in part because the United States, which had been declining, has now stopped declining. China inevitably has gone up. The rise of China should not be surprising. Indians have for long believed that the knowledge of English gives them some kind of special privilege. That's complete nonsense. China is doing well in software exports or broadly computer and information services because Chinese universities, especially in math and computer science, are now amongst the best in the world, not just in Asia, but amongst the top 10 universities in math and science. China probably has 2 or 3 of them. On the right-hand side, you see pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals, again, is a sector in which India did well. Again, there is a temptation to call pharmaceuticals high-tech industry. That's misleading because India produces the low end of this high-tech. Nevertheless, you see sometime around 2014, the Indian share began to flatten out. It began to flatten out because the Food and Drug Administration of the United States, the country that receives the most cheap Indian drugs, the FDA began to do more intrusive inspections of Indian pharmaceutical companies and found them to be lacking in quality control, both in terms of record keeping as well as of manufacturing standards. And again, you see China is catching up. So yes, there were these two areas in which India did well and maybe potentially can do well, but these are also sectors where the early advantage seems to be slowly eroded by the Chinese behemoth. So if India has not done well in manufactured exports and even is also now struggling in software exports, where exactly has the Indian GDP growth come from? And as I will show you in a minute, the key growth source have been finance and construction. And the reason this is important is that finance and construction lead to poor job creation. And importantly, they lead to a culture in which social norms and public accountability begin to erode. So notice over here in this chart, this is the share of each sector in national value added. Agriculture has come down as we would predict. The sector that has grown the fastest is finance and real estate. Look at manufacturing, that's the red line. Start of liberalization in the mid-80s. Manufacturing was supposed to stimulate manufacturing. In fact, manufacturing fell, has stabilized, and is still lower than where it was 25, 30 years ago. The other sector that has grown in terms of GDP share is construction. But you're going to see construction much more visibly in employment. Notice over here now, the finance disappears because finance has a large share of GDP, but employs handfuls of people. Notice also over here that IT is missing, information technology. A student of mine, when he saw these charts, asked me, where is IT? And then he answered his question himself. It's too small. It's too small to be seen in these charts. So you see in both Tamil Nadu, a relatively advanced state, and Bihar, whether in the rural area or in the urban area, the sector where employment has grown is construction. Construction provides relatively poor jobs. They're risky jobs with high propensity to injury. Yes, somewhat higher wages than in agriculture. So to that extent, you will see in a minute that poverty begins to come down during this period, but not because we are getting good jobs, but we are getting jobs that are slightly better paying than in agriculture and precarious jobs. Construction is also important because construction, as is true worldwide, is the source, is the home of organized crime. And construction has become part of the Indian economy, and at the same time has given a steady supply of oxygen to organized crime, especially in the area of illegal sand mining. As some of you know, sand, along with cement, is an essential ingredient in the making of concrete, which then goes into construction. Therefore, construction, while an improvement over agriculture in terms of livelihood, is only a marginal improvement. Plus, it creates a culture of eroding social norms and public accountability. This is finally a chart on poverty, because the one reaction you get when you hear sort of a bleak assessment like mine is, oh, well, of course, but poverty has come down. Yes, poverty has come down. On the left-hand side, you see the $1.90 per day poverty line, which was the old poverty line. India is black. Yes, India has come down, but notice again, Bangladesh has come down faster, and China and Vietnam have virtually eliminated by 2011, have virtually eliminated the extreme poverty, which is less than $1.90 a day. Sometime in 2017, the World Bank said, for middle-income countries, the $2 a day line does not adequately represent the social benchmarks of decent living. That it would be more appropriate for these countries to have a $3.20 line. By that standard, too, Indian poverty has come down. But again, notice that in 2011, which is the last data we have, something over 60% of Indians were poor by the $3.20 line. Notice again that China and Vietnam have not only eliminated the $2 poverty, but also the $3 poverty. Put differently, I call the gap between the people who live between $2 and $3, I call them the precarious poor. They are precarious in the sense that one job loss, one major illness in the family, one large wedding in the family can bring you down from this zone into the less than $2, the less than $2 zone. In other words, those who are between $3 and $2 live a very precarious and fearful life. China, Vietnam, every major Latin American country has eliminated both extreme poverty as well as precariousness. There is a lot of speculation, and for some reason yesterday somebody tweeted a set of numbers showing Indian poverty has come down substantially since 2011. Anybody who says that is making up the numbers, because there are no numbers since 2011. There was, in fact, a survey in 2018-19 which showed that poverty had gone up. Yes, the 2018-19 survey showed that poverty had gone up. The government promptly rejected that survey, saying that that could not be true. We know that poverty went up again in the COVID years. So the best we know is that Indian poverty rates, especially measured by the $3 line, continue to be relatively high. You see sort of a mirror of that in the bottom charts, where again you see malnutrition. India tends to have relatively high malnutrition. This is the flip side of India. This is the glamorous India. This is the Adani stock price, Gautam Adani's stock price after 2014. May 2014, Narendra Modi becomes Prime Minister. Gautam Adani flies Narendra Modi from Ahmedabad to Delhi in his private jet. On one side of the jet is the Adani logo, on the other side is the Indian national flag. Adani and India becomes synonymous, and Adani's stock price takes off with the flight trajectory of that journey from Ahmedabad to Delhi. Finally, I talk about what I call the moral failures. The moral failures is in effect a spotlight in the two areas where the erosion of norms and accountability has been particularly acute, and where things have actually, even in absolute terms, become worse. The first is the judicial system. These here are the number of cases awaiting trial. The number of cases awaiting trial has steadily gone up. In other words, people get arrested and they languish in jail for years sometimes, just waiting for a trial. In other words, they spend more time in jail sometimes than they would have if they had been convicted of the crimes they are alleged to have committed. Very often, as again, number of movies have shown, very often, while awaiting crime, these prisoners are subject to custodial torture to extract confession. This is a a major plague on the system which preys especially on the poor and vulnerable. The share of legislators charged with serious crimes, with the phrase serious crimes implying things like murder, rape, kidnapping, extortion, the share of legislators with serious crimes in two states, again, Bihar and Tamil Nadu, has steadily gone up. Tamil Nadu is less. Tamil Nadu is traditionally considered a well-run progressive state. But notice that over time, Tamil Nadu is becoming more like Bihar rather than Bihar becoming more like Tamil Nadu. This here chart is at the Indian national level. On the left-hand side are the campaign expenses for elections to the Indian Parliament. India is represented by the black bars. In 2009, Indian campaign expenditures, which was less than half of the US campaign expenditures in 2008, which was the nearest election year in the United States when both the president and the Congress were elected. By 2014, India was catching up. And by 2019, the Indian campaign expenditures were substantially larger than in the US presidential, the nearest US presidential and congressional election, which was 2016. On the right-hand side are the share of criminals with share of criminally charged politicians charged with serious crimes. The same again, rape, murder, kidnapping, extortion, etc. Notice over here, the black bar is the serious crimes. Over 25% of the parliamentarians in the Lok Sabha have been charged with serious crimes. Finally, the death of rivers. This is the famous pharmaceutical industry. This video is shot in the city of Hyderabad, which is the pharma capital of India. The river Musi runs through Hyderabad, and the pharma industry is killing the river.
So this is coming from the factories down there,
And that is upstream.
and they dump it in the river.
Yeah.
And where do you take the samples?
I took the samples there also.
Yeah, it worked also on my eyes. The foam is then from the pollution.
Yeah, pollution.
This is the river Ganga, which has been the attempt to clean which have been going on for the last 70 odd years. Most recently, there has been a national mission to clean the Ganga. Parts of the Ganga have been made very glamorous, but this video shot relatively in the last few weeks near one of the most glamorous parts of the newly rejuvenated, revived Ganga. It is my contention in this collage that every major river in India is heavily polluted and dying. On the left-hand side is the river Asi, which gives Varanasi half its name. The river Asi, which in my youth, when I used to visit Banaras, because my mother was from Banaras, is a tributary of the Ganga. You notice over here the rivers are polluted because of chaotic urbanization. Today, citizens of Banaras no longer call it the Asi River, they call it the Asi Nala, the Asi Drain. On the right-hand side is Noyal, which is a river that runs by this town of Tirupur, famous for its garment industry. These are the dyes and chemicals which are generating the foam on the river Noyal. The Sabarmati in the west, and the Yamuna, which has been dirty for the last 30 years at least. Finally, on COVID, I'm not going to talk very much about COVID itself. But every major catastrophe reveals and amplifies pre-existing pathologies. And the main theme of COVID was that Indian agriculture remains distressed. People want to get out of agriculture, but the urban jobs are scarce. So there are not very many options to go out to, because urban jobs scarcity. And all this is embedded in gross income and wealth inequalities. So this video is from a movie, Dharti Ke Lal, made in 1946, representing the Bengal famine of 1943. There was a famine in Bengal, as everybody remembers. Many villagers migrated to Calcutta in the hope that they could earn a living. Frustrated by the brutality of the city, they are here returning back to their villages. This reverse trek is symptomatic of a distressed agriculture and poor jobs, poor living conditions in cities. This is the COVID reverse trek. Almost 75 years later from the Bengal famine, the same reverse trek. Yes, people are better dressed, and the environment looks like we have made a lot of progress, but the basic symptoms are the same.
Dejected and desperate to be united with families, they grabbed at any opportunity that came their way. A few bought second-hand bicycles with the last of their money to pedal home 1,000 kilometers away.
And these are the health expenditures, healthcare spending per capita, hospital beds per 1,000 people. India is in the lower left-hand corner. And through COVID, you see the Adani stock price skyrocketed again, one more time, even from the high levels it had achieved pre-COVID. So I end by asking, is the Indian jobs challenge insurmountable? In 2019, the Indian Railways announced that they would have 35,000 jobs. 12.5 million people applied for those 35,000 jobs. In other words, for every person who would eventually get a job, 350 would not. Sometime in January 2022, the railway said, oops, we are not yet ready to offer the jobs we had promised. And here's what happened.
Burning trains, protest on tracks, lathi charge and tear gas shelling. For over 48 hours now, a raging battle is on between railway exam students and the government.
So in conclusion, this is my final slide. By my estimate, India needs 200 million jobs over the next decade to fully employ its working age population. Why is this a virtually insurmountable challenge? Because in the last decade, there has been no increase in net jobs. Likely today, there are fewer people employed than there were 10 years ago. And in addition to the existing handicaps, which I've discussed, there are new challenges to lives and livelihoods. Dying rivers, a generally degraded environment, and a rushing climate crisis, which is here, not in the future. So Razi said he wanted to hear why I say India is broken. This here is my answer. I promised you by my title, a grim prognosis. I believe I have delivered that prognosis, and I'm happy to be challenged. So let me stop sharing my screen and hear Mr. Abu Saleh Sharif's comments and then general comments.
Yes, indeed, it is very grim and very depressing. So let's hear our another economist, Dr. Abu Saleh Sharif Saab.
Good evening from Bangalore. I hope it is good afternoon in Washington, D.C. Am I audible to people?
Yes.
Right. Thank you very much. I'm so privileged to hear Professor Ashoka Mody. A brilliant analysis, factual data analysis, international comparisons, over a period of comparisons. I'm delighted to hear him, although I'm a bit excited at the moment that I have not yet read his book. Very provoking title, India is broken. Is India is broken? I guess the question is India is broken? We can debate about it. There are both sides to it. I'm not getting into that debate now, but I want to carry forward his discussion with a few structural issues which I feel would enrich Professor Ashoka Mody's analysis. I hope he has already done it. Obviously, in a presentation of this nature, you can't cover all the issues. But I would like to know a little bit more, if not during the question answers, subsequently as well. Maybe he has written an article, or maybe he's going to write a new chapter. But first, I want to begin. I have 6 to 8 minutes. I have to begin with an observation. I am educated and trained in India, although educated abroad, but my all working life, where I made money out of my work, total 100% is in India, has been in India until 2012. And that is when I retired in quotes. Somehow in India, age is a very strong factor for your current income levels. I couldn't negotiate my salary, so I try to find out where I can. My age is not a factor in my living, and so I migrated to USA. I live in Washington, D.C. We established US-India Policy Institute, started working with it. It's a small, but it provided me opportunity to move around in Washington, D.C. Platforms where debates about India do take place. They do take place. And I was physically present. Brookings institutions, Carnegie's, even State Department discussions, often at the Capitol Hill. My office was just across next to the Supreme Court on the Capitol Hill. So it was easy for me to physically present there. And for my surprise, whenever the issues on India was debated, because initially I was reluctant to talk in a new environment, and I used to see that almost nobody who was debating about India knew anything about India at all. The statistics which was presented, for example, by Professor Mody, the only discussion took place as to how to build businesses, particularly in warfare technologies and patents and pharmaceutical patents issues, I was devastated. I was devastated, and I made courage to say, hey guys, you are talking about India, but you want to do business, you want to know India better to do business with India. And nobody would listen to me. So this is my, वो बोलते हैं ना in Hindi भड़ास निकालना, मुझे बहुत दर्द होता है. In a international platforms, India is not adequately understood in policy, international policy making. So that is a kind of tangential observation which I want to make. Now coming to professors, I'm so happy that the professor brought some very fundamental issues which are persistently present since independence, since people like us are born and grown in India. As I told you, I worked all my work life in India. I've gone through the process. So the issue, he did not use the word demographic dividend. Me being trained both in demographic and economics, I love to use that word. That word is understood well. Age factor, the India. I know even China is going to import, already importing labor. And you go to any plane, any airport, anywhere in the world, you feel Indians there. And most of the streets in Melbourne, which I spent last 1 month, I thought I was in Delhi in Melbourne, Punjabis, Hindi speaking everywhere. So there is going to be an outburst of Indian floating around for next 20, 30 years. Fine. Oh, but some people say, hey guys, these people are leaving India because India is not giving an opportunity. I don't subscribe to that idea. India still gives opportunities. There are opportunities in India. However, Professor brought some very important structural issues. So I want to just itemize them in a slightly different way. And I request Mody Sahab to bring this in his analysis. So I see rural-urban difference. And for last 40 years, the difference is not bridging at all. There was approximately between 20 and 24% gap. And I've not done more recent data, but I'm sure this gap has not come closer. It has not bridged the gap, rural-urban. If at all, the rural-urban gap could have been increased, not decreased, in many parameters, because there are innumerable parameters we have to consider. The second gap is you have rural-urban gap, and within rural and within urban, you have gender gap. And the gender gap is between 20 and 24%. So if you bring rural, urban, and gender gap together, so now you see the parameter multipliers are increasing. But in India, that is not the end. In India, there is another parameter, which is regional. Bihar and Kerala, UP and Karnataka, regional, huge. So now if you are in a rural area, if you are a female, and if you are in Bihar, your condition is very, very different. You have now multiplied more structural issues there. And then since some of the work which I did, I wrote incidentally the first human development report for India in 2000 when I presented the poverty rate of 33%, and Montek Singh Aliwa was at that time was presenting a poverty rate of I think 18%, and then I argued with the Planning Commission, no, you have done something wrong, you go and do your and then he revised and he came back, and after my publication of the Human Development Report, he revised the poverty rate to around 30% at that time. Now, there are issues there. So at that time, I encountered another disparity of socio-religious categories in India. Your rural-urban difference, male-female difference, regional difference, and then there are differences of communities. It's just not the scheduled caste and the non-scheduled caste which the government publishes data, but there are other elements, particularly of minorities, in this case, Muslims. Now, I want to end the last one very important element of how Muslim education, because education is one of the most important parameter Professor raised, how Muslims are trapped into low education system by the government policies. I just want to conclude that. But now, having given this multi-level differentiations, there are also multi-sectoral differentiations in India, particularly in the labor market. Professor has talked about rural and et cetera, and this is a very complex structure. But the important point is somehow India's growth, there is growth in India. There has been growth in real terms. The real wages have never declined in India. Somehow they catch us up. They are very low compared to international standards, but the real wages are never down. They are always positive. And that is where, I love there is something good is happening. It is very slow, but it is still positive. But the growth is bypassing the very traditional channel of transferring resources from low productivity to better productivity. The normal classical is from agriculture, rural, et cetera, to a kind of industrial manufacturing and then to services. But India is bypassing manufacturing. Probably China is a factor because China was so dominant, India couldn't do anything. So I would appreciate Professor Mody to talk a little bit about why is India could not develop its industrialization and manufacturing sector. Why is that its supply chains, issue is so dominant that India cannot, even now, if it wants to, even now it put billion, it cannot compete. So how to affect, where was the policy problem? Was it pre-reform or post-reform or during Nehru or now what Modi ji is doing? Whether Modi ji is doing anything at all on economic policy, I don't know. He did not make any comment on current policy making situation. So the capital shift from low to sectors, low rate of return to high, is a major issue. So I want to know whether it is investments, whether it is public investment or even international investments. How are they coming in India? And how that interact with our demographic dividends where our education levels are still low. Notionally, we have almost achieved 100% enrollment rate, and it doesn't say anything about quality of education. There is only one survey where the NCAER, where I used to live, right in the first human development report, we started doing a bit of quality checks about. So even metric educated, pre-university educated, if you give them some simple solutions, they are unable, their language skills are low, their IT skills are low. Millions and millions of people, they seem to have some degrees, but they cannot compete. They are not in a position to compete, including the engineering degrees. So the issue of bypassing industrial sector and the quality of education, why, what happened, is what I would like a little bit more to know. The morality failure, I very deeply thank Professor Mody that you brought this. It is very important. The accountability in the judiciary is important. The accountability and criminality in elections and the system, the electoral systems are very important. And the water pollution is deep in my heart. You gave an example of Andhra Pradesh, Hyderabad possibly. But I used to work in Ahmedabad in 1980s. I used to travel by train from Ahmedabad to Bangalore. Bangalore is my hometown. And every river I used to pass was polluted in that Ahmedabad to Bombay route. Even now, I have not recently gone. I have plans now to go a road trip to some of these states, but our water. And the most important point is just this morning, when in my home here, I didn't have water, so we had to call a tanker truck to come and put it, and I asked him where did he bring his water. He said, I have a license on my land to draw this water. He is a farmer. So then he has a different rate to electricity rate to pump the water out. He has a different rate for his agriculture. He has different rate for his house. But the issue is we have already depleted our water tables. Water, river pollution on surface is one issue, but we have already sown almost irreversible desertification process is already done. I think that is one of the biggest, pain and curse on India, which we are going to face, and our competition because of the lack of water, because of we are going to lose out, and that is my prediction. So I appreciate Professor Mody to comment on that issue. Broadly with this, one thing which I want to say is, generally, I want to go around and see what happened to people. Are they okay? I know the migration issue. I know the impact of migration. I was right present in Anand Vihar. My home in Delhi was right there. From my 7th floor, I can see millions of people walking. I watched that for a month, women, children walking. I've seen what is happening there. In spite of all that, what I have seen is, over a period of time, the quality of life is slowly but certainly progressing. The kind of poverty we would have seen 30 years ago, it is slightly different now. One major is, in spite of the migration problem, still we can migrate from one place to another, and migration is cheap. For example, buying a ticket for 500 rupees from Calcutta to Bangalore, people can still travel. No, so migration is one of the most cherished opportunity for Indians to not only integrate India, but also to bring some sort of equalization in the wage rates and real wages. So I'm very proud of that. And there were some comments about Bangladesh, how Bangladesh is it single one sector, more women getting into, is that an ideal comparison to make to India? I don't think India can follow the Bangladesh example. Bangladesh has done it all on its own, but India is a highly complex economy. As I suggested, there are many layers of structural issues. But the unfortunate thing is, there is no respect, and there is no demand for the kind of research Professor Ashoka Mody ji has done, and some other work which I've been doing. There is no respect for that in India today. So that is the.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Saleh Saab, and thank you so much, Mody ji. And before we go to question and answer session, let me just remind you for the upcoming Saturday event. Presenter is Danish Iqbal. This one is totally different. It is on Kabir, on the Sufi and Bhakti theme. So please join him. And we will have a lot of other artists and singers on Kabir. Lutf Group Delhi, very familiar for our events. So over to Dr. Rafat Hussain, who joined a little late. So I believe that he can get the theme of whatever part he could, and he will moderate the question and answer session. Rafat?
Yeah, thank you, Rajibai. My apologies that I didn't join on time. So the question and answer session is open. So there are two ways that you can raise your digital hand. Let me see. Or you can chat in the chat box.
And therefore, there are a lot of write-ups in the chat.
Yeah.
As
yeah, see that. So let's begin with the one not in the order. My question is, you had an opportunity. So the question is, have you an opportunity, Mody Saab, to give this presentation to the government?
No, I have not. I've made a lot of number of presentations in India, but not to the government.
Mm-hmm.
We couldn't hear you, sir. Your reply, your sound was.
You did not hear my answer? No, my answer was no. I have not responded. I have not had an opportunity to speak to any government official.
Thank you. So the
will they hear to your interventions? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a hypothetical question. Why don't we discuss something more substantive right now, including some of your interventions? I'm happy to respond to them.
So Dayanandan Saab, do you want to ask your question or should I go ahead?
Read it, just read it.
Okay. So corruption has been pervasive in India. What does corruption play in all the parameters you mentioned in Breaking India?
Corruption is a very, very central feature. There is a temptation sometimes to say that to postulate a notion of good corruption and bad corruption. A number of people are tempted to say, well, corruption is like a tax and it helps to speed up things. It's called speed money. That's complete nonsense. Corruption has been embedded in the Indian system since even just before independence. It grew in Pandit Nehru's time. It then exploded in Mrs. Gandhi's time. The problem with corruption is that it becomes a bad equilibrium. In other words, there comes a point at which if a sufficient number of people are corrupt, then by virtue of that, everybody has to be corrupt. Because to be not corrupt means being left out. For example, Mr. Abu Saleh Sharif was talking about digging groundwater wells to dig groundwater out. So if my neighbor digs a well of 50 feet, I dig a well of 75 feet, which makes him dig to 100 feet, which makes me dig to 150 feet. And there is a race because it is rational for me to dig deeper than everybody else before everybody else depletes the water. So corruption is like a race where I want to get ahead of the other person. So there's a famous phrase, do unto others as you would do unto them. But what happens with corruption is you do unto others before they do unto you. So it becomes a marauding zero-sum game in which destruction becomes a primary motive force. Corruption also leads to criminality. The borderline between corruption and crime is a very thin one. If you are corrupt, you are then tempted to move into criminal activities. So corruption becomes the corrosive force on norms and accountability. Notice that I have not focused very much on specific policy measures. I've done so deliberately because it's clear to me what the policy measures should be. And I think clear to most people what the policy measure should be. The real problem is that every policy measure that you can think of, even if well-intentioned, can be distorted, can be hijacked. For example, a very, very important example. India is supposed to have some of the best environmental laws in the world, including on water pollution, including on preservation of the rivers. But why? Why, despite these laws, do we continue to have such intensive pollution? Because there is a story about a sugarcane factory in Uttar Pradesh. And the sugarcane factory is connected to the Uttar Pradesh Control Board, Pollution Control Board, in real time, 24/7 monitoring. But if in my factory, I put the probe in clean water rather than in the sugarcane processing area where it is supposed to measure the pollution, instead it will measure the clean water. And you can do that in connivance with the Pollution Control Board. So the destruction of norms and the free-ranging application of a law of jungle, that means that there is no policy that can be made to work if people choose to further their narrow self-interest above everything else.
Thank you so much. Satyanath Saab, Satyanath Chaudhary Saab, your question is very long, so please go ahead and read yourself and please be brief. Unmute yourself, Satyanath Saab.
Yeah. Now you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, first of all, let me mention that it was a very, very enlightening presentation. I would love to share the whole thing, the whole speech with people. So please, Raji Saab, put it on line as soon as possible. Now, I was kind of disappointed to find that the lack of enough investment in elementary and primary education was not mentioned in the challenges facing India, as you outlined in the last slide. There were 3 of them mentioned. They truly are challenges, but I would have liked to see this lack of focus on elementary and primary education there. There are people who talk of aspiration of 6% of GDP or some kind of Indian budget or something towards education, which has consistently not been met by all of the past governments, more so under Mody. Why are we stuck with 6% of the GDP or Indian budget or whatever for education? I was looking at the budgetary allocation of our government in Delhi, and I found it to be about 25% of the state budget. As a result, they can flaunt their performance in education all over the world. Why shouldn't the aspiration be raised from 6% to 25%? In light of the practically everybody agreeing, including, of course, you, that lack of proper education is at the root of miserable state of India. I thank you very much. Bye.
So the answer to your question is threefold. First, that last slide, I just listed what I call the new challenges. Education is a 75-year-old challenge, and I can only agree 100% with you that we need much deeper investment in education. The current government will make the claim that even the 3% odd that they are investing in education is being poorly spent. And therefore, the first task is to spend that money better before raising it to 6%. That is a cop-out, as the Americans would say. We need both. There's no question that we need both. We need to make a very intensive effort to spend the money well. The problem of quality of education that I highlighted and that Professor Sharif also emphasized on is because the whole system of teacher quality, the process by which teachers are qualified and certified, is so poor that we need to clean up that system. That system is plagued by corruption. So we clearly need a cleaning up of the educational system, and we need more investment. Now, one last comment. The reason this will not find resonance in the government, this government or the previous government or governments that have gone before them, this is a perennial problem. The reason it does not find resonance is that it is much simpler and much more politically attractive to build a flyover. When you build a flyover, you can show somebody, look, I built this flyover. Whereas if you spend money on education, you don't see the benefits of that education quality improving in say 6 months or even a year. Education is by its nature what economists call an invisible public good. It is complex, it is long horizon, whereas a flyover is a simple structure, it's visible, and it can be done relatively quickly. So the temptation for politicians always is to create these visible monuments, which give them, they believe, some kind of political payoff. Whereas education, despite the aspirations of people, they should be having payoff, but they don't. Instead, it's much easier to give a gas cylinder or to build a toilet or to give rations. But to give people the public goods that are necessary so that they no longer need the crutch of these private goods that are given as freebies, that then reduces the dependence of the voters on the government authorities, and hence makes it somewhat risky that they might not vote for you in the future. But when if you hold them beholden through the supply of private goods, you have a greater likelihood that people will come back to you and say, oh, well, he gave me a gas cylinder, therefore I need to vote for him. So there is a deep political problem in the supply of education and healthcare, and therefore these remain undersupplied unless the norms and accountability change in a fundamental way.
May I ask a follow-up question? Small,
No, please. Thank you so much. Because we have if time permits, we will come back, please.
Okay.
Because there are so many people lined up here. Abha Saab, please go ahead. So please hold your questions, Srinath Saab. We will come back.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Ashoka Mody, for writing this book. I haven't read it and I hope to read the book. What I was thinking was the part where you mentioned about prisons. So I happened to attend this book launch called Women Incarcerated, edited by Mahua Bandhopadhyay. And there were a few people who've been in the prison who are out on bail, and they were sharing their experience. And so I'm a student of social science and gender studies. I'm not a student of economics, so I wouldn't know. So what I was really trying to understand from you is, so this kind of unpaid labor inside prisons done by Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi and Muslim women, because their population is at a higher rise inside prisons. This kind of unpaid labor, in the sense that the daily wage that these women and every prisoner is entitled to is not provided, and there's a cut that is taken away by the prison in the name of sort of maintaining the prison structure and etc., maintenance of prison. So what happens to women in the sense that DBA Muslim women sort of become the foundation, their unpaid labor inside prison and the larger prison industrial complex, right? So how do you see that keeping the global economics and Indian specific post CA also with, you have your camps in Assam and Northeast, right? So I don't know if my question is clear, but how do you see women and incarceration and unpaid labor is sort of the question. Thank you.
Look, you've asked a very interesting and very pointed question, and a question that goes to the heart of any sensitive individual. All I can say is that this is a detail that I have not studied, and so I'm not going to be in a position to give you a sensible answer. I am much more acutely aware of the general problem of incarceration. the general problem rather than a sort of gender specific or community specific problem. It's clear that the weak and vulnerable are in that large group of incarcerated people without any rights. For me, what is important over here, and this pertains to this specific example you're giving, is that people's rights are being vitiated. So when we say that, we are the world's largest democracy and we are incarcerating such large numbers of people, often for long periods of time without giving them the rights to defend themselves in an appropriate way, I think it's a sort of a very severe problem of undermining democracy. And so I'm going to leave it at that very general level, because your detailed question is not something that I have any expertise in offering.
Thank you, Professor Mody. The next question is from Sal Khan. So let me read this question quickly. Because there is not already enough job available for men, if the woman enters into the job market, there will be more unemployment. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, look, if we start dealing with every question as a zero-sum game, yes, we have a problem. My basic thought process throughout the book is that we need to create more jobs. The issue is not to bring in women into the workforce as sort of a substitute for men. The issue is to create jobs for men and for women, and especially for women. And the key variable, besides sort of the supply side of better education, on the demand side, we need a much weaker exchange rate. Indians have traditionally become very attached to the value of the rupee. If the value goes from 80 rupees to 80 rupees and 20 paisa, there is a national outcry that the rupee is going down the drain. That is just simply bad economics. If a country that has an uncompetitive manufacturing sector, where there are so many handicaps to manufacturing, instead of devaluing the currency or making the currency much cheaper, as every single East Asian country has done in the growth phase of its manufactured exports, we are doing giveaways like production-linked incentives and so on. So we are giving freebies in any case. But if we had a much cheaper exchange rate, much cheaper currency, much cheaper currency, then I believe that there would be a greater demand for Indian manufactured exports, which would create jobs for men and for women.
Thank you. So the next is Rudranshu, Dr. Rudranshu, after the Shrikant, and then Ramanamurthy, please. So Rudranshu. Dr. Singh, unmute. Let me try. Okay, I ask it. Okay, it's working now.
Thank you. It was a treat attending to Professor Mody's lecture. And my question would be a continuation of the last question that you attended to. Is less female participation in the labor force in India is a sign of a weak economy, or are we a weak economy? That is why it is there.
And I think the answer is yes. The answer is both your propositions apply. We are a weak economy, therefore we employ a few women, and because we employ a few women, we are a weak economy. In the end, we need to strengthen the demand for exports through the principal mechanism being a cheaper currency, and we need to create a safer work environment for women so that they come into the workforce. Why? So let me just spend a minute and talk about why employment of women is so important. The historical process going back to the Industrial Revolution has been that when more women work, they tend to have fewer children. Their children tend to be educated. The children delay their marriage ages. The children have fewer children. And so the process of bringing women into the workforce creates a virtuous cycle of fertility decline and higher productivity growth. It is not, unlike the proposition or the position from which I think Sharanya was approaching this as a matter of gender equity. It is completely true that we need more gender equity. But here I'm talking purely from the perspective of a cold-blooded economist, that from an economic point of view, bringing women into the workforce creates a natural process of demographic change and productivity growth, which is the process that is inevitable, which has occurred in every single successful country. One last observation I'll make over here is that there's a very beautiful quote by a political scientist named Robin Jeffries, who wrote about Kerala's success with female education. And he said that an educated man educates his sons, an educated woman educates her family.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very beautiful way of encapsulating this, that it creates a virtuous cycle. And that cycle then begins to self-sustain to help a long-term evolutionary growth process.
Thank you. So since we are talking on education, I give the chance to Satyanath Saab to complete his thoughts. Please go ahead very briefly. Finish it, and this is only a comment.
Yeah. What I want to say can be applied to all problems, but it is especially pertinent to educational endeavors. The people in power, the elites, see advancement of especially the underclass as a challenge to their own hegemony. Hence, the elites at all levels of power would like to sabotage educational endeavors of the subalterns, especially. What do you think about this comment? And if you find any logic in it, how would you go about solving it?
Thank you.
TK, I'm very sympathetic to the comment. I would put it slightly differently, which is that there is a clear relationship in the international data between countries or regions that have very high inequality and at the same time have relatively low educational investment and educational achievements. And the reason for that is very simple, that when there are some very rich people, they tend to have privileged education for their own children. For example, in India right now, how many of the richest Indians have started sending their kids abroad to study or to some very elite schools in which they pay international prices? What does that mean? That means is that even if they do not actively repress the broader educational system, they certainly neglect it. They consider it low priority. Therefore, the priority that is set in the policy-making process place diminished value on public goods that are of mass value, whereas services and tax breaks and so on that are beneficial mainly to the elite get higher value because they contribute to campaign expenses and so on. So in a system which has very high inequalities, you are going to get this neglect of public goods because that is of low priority to the people who matter in the setting the policy priorities.
Thank you so much. And the next person was Sri Khan Saab. I don't see him.
I'm here.
So by different name, maybe. Go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm not an economist, but I enjoyed your presentation very much. Your analysis says that we need 200 million jobs in India in the next 10 years. Did we need 100 million in the last 10 years? If that is true, the rate of unemployment has not gone up significantly in India. It did not decrease significantly. Do you think there's a role of informal economy that is generating a lot of jobs that we don't take into account? Does your analysis take into account the informal economy, which is very robust in India at this time? That's my first question. Second question is, a lot of examples that you gave us in your comparison were very small countries like Taiwan or Singapore or other countries who had authoritarian regimes or military rules or single party governments. Those governments had easy time pushing down their policies if they have good national interest principles in place. Do you think our democracy in India has this democracy drag on our GDP or prosperity that we talked about multiple times? That we are running about 26 to 29 governments there, autonomous countries over there. So it's very difficult for a unified policy to be propagated or to be translated into reality. Because according to certain analysis, India has lost about 2 to 3% of GDP per year since independence. Any comments on these two things, please?
So on your latter comment on democracy versus autocracy, there, if you look again at the past 70 odd years, or even further back, how many autocracies have been successful? Maybe 3 or 4. Most autocracies end up in spectacular failures. The Uganda, for example, Idi Amin's Uganda, or Zaire of Mobutu. Coming closer to home, we had a period of autocracy under Mrs. Gandhi from 75 to 77. She did not even try to solve the kinds of fundamental problems that we are talking about. Autocracies tend to have very, especially when they become personalized in and identified with one individual, tend to be very arbitrary in terms of their policy priorities.
Thank you.
Just to complete the thought, the East Asians have been successful.
Yes.
And the East Asians have been successful. Is it because they were autocracies? Maybe. But where have they been successful? They have been successful in education, in health, in bringing women into the labor force. So it's a paradox that what the East Asians have done, even successful democracies struggle to do. And certainly autocracies of the kind of Zaire and Uganda almost never do. Therefore, I am very skeptical of the notion that if India was more autocratic, somehow our education system would improve, somehow our health system would improve. Just for example, again, when Prime Minister Narendra Modi came to power, the Financial Times wrote that here is a man who can avoid the normal checks and balances of a democracy. And therefore, we should applaud him because he is going to create a growth dynamic which will create a flourishing and healthy economy. I don't see any sign of it. I certainly don't see sign of job growth. I certainly don't see any sign of education and health sector development. So autocracies are very seductive, but only because there are a handful of East Asian autocracies that have succeeded. The vast majority end in causing pillage and depredation to their societies rather than improving them.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor. Ramana Murthy, sir.
Thank you very much. Am I audible, sir?
Yes.
I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, sir. I'm intrigued by the title of your book, which I shall certainly buy and read it at some time. That India is broken and it cannot be fixed. I'm intrigued by the second part of it. Part of the answer I got in terms of your demographic reasoning, in terms of non-inclusion of women, etc., and the poor. And if you see the other part, there must be a larger political economy. Also, perhaps must have been a big reason for why it cannot fix either the present dispensation or even the Congress party, which if it comes to power, any of these the present bourgeois parties, do they have the capacity when their tax GDP, the taxation capacity of the economy has been going down. It has gone down from 16% to 10% and marginally increased in the recent times. So it has got no money for education, no money for health, no money for properly for education and parks or any other infrastructure. And hence, given this kind of after liberalization in India, Indian state seems to have got lost its control about its taxable capacity, and this is the least it can do. I'm not talking about the close association which the South Korean state and Japanese state maintained with the industry, in a very strategic manner, how to increase its exports and so on. You have not really touched, but I wish you say something on these.
Thank you.
So I'll be brief on this. My concern is that when we are in a bad equilibrium, where politicians have lost the anchor of norms and accountability, it's not clear that there is a silver bullet in a particular individual and or a particular party. As you quite rightly point out, that with the start of liberalization in the 1991 version of that, there was a moment of sanity there. The devaluation was very important, especially the one that came a few years later. But there was no investment in education, healthcare, in improving the judicial system, in improving the quality of the cities. Somehow that was left to fend for itself. And the problem is that under the name of liberalization, we created what I call an unregulated capitalism. So a new form of rush for natural resources, for construction contracts, for land, for water began and created a new form of corruption. So liberalization got rid of the license permit Raj, created a new form of corruption in these other production sources, and so did not change the norms and values which are essential for providing long-term investment in public goods. Therefore, will a new regime make a difference? Not if it conducts business as usual, not if the motive force of the economy remains an unregulated capitalism. There has to be a commitment to a more responsible capitalism and a commitment, therefore, simultaneously to public goods for a much more widespread and much more equitable growth process.
Thank you, Professor. Next is Dayanandan Saab. Please go ahead and unmute. I already asked you to unmute. Okay, try now.
To read, follow up. First question of the. I thought you were going to read. I'm sorry. Follow up of the education. If the standard of private educations are good, then why should the government have any inclination to invest 6% or 8%? Currently, foreign universities are being invited in higher education sphere. Long ago, even during Rajiv Gandhi's time, it was said that the beneficiary must pay. So the government is in effect washing its hands off good quality education by privatizing it.
So I hear the question. It's not clear to me which side of this debate you stand on. All I can say is, well, I'll say two things. One, with the best of my knowledge, and again, the reason I look back at history is because history tells us what is feasible and what is not. There is no example that I know of where private education has been a substitute for public education. In other words, there is no country that has created mass education through private provision of education services. Let us stipulate for a moment, maybe the time has come to change. Just because history has not given us an example does not mean that looking forward we should not have an go that way. So then let's compare the performance of public and private schools. When we say that private education is good, the surveys show only one thing. The surveys show that private education is more cost effective. In other words, they deliver a certain result for somewhat lower costs, because the private schools are able to pay their teachers less and are able to also save on some of the facilities that they might otherwise have given. Yes, there are some very elite private schools. Rule them out, because that's not what we are talking about. We are talking about mass private schools. The mass private schools do not necessarily produce higher quality education. For one thing, they tend to overemphasize teaching in English. Now, I'm somebody who believes in the value of English, and certainly in the value of teaching science and medicine in English. But certain basic skills like arithmetic, reading, comprehension have to be conducted in the native language. That is the process worldwide. Children learn in languages that are native to them, which they speak at home. Private education tends to be considered more prestigious because they teach more English. Private schools also scrimp on facilities like labs and so on. So the average private school also does not get necessarily better teachers in terms of overall quality. So altogether, the experience that we've had even in India with private schools is at best mixed. There is no sense that this is a silver bullet which will have a lasting solution. So I'm skeptical, and I feel that the moment we let go of the public responsibility for some of these public goods, we create additional risks of charlatans entering this process and making things worse rather than better. And there could be various unintended consequences that I'm not able to visualize. And then finally, it's just horribly expensive. Do we want to inflict high costs on the poor and vulnerable when it should be the public exchequer and the taxpayer, the rich taxpayer, who bears the burden of educating children? I mean, look at the United States. Till the early 20th century, United States had one of the most successful education systems. It was based on property taxes. Property taxes are an equalizing force. I pay for the education of my neighbor's children. I pay for the education of next generation of children who will be born in my neighborhood. Why? Because I believe it's the right thing to do. That it creates a sense of community and equity. And unless we approach education with this sense of community and equity, rather than as a commercial enterprise, I fear we are not going to get very far on these topics.
Yeah, very well said. Thank you. So before I move to Abdul Jabbar Saab, there are a few comments by Mehraj on the Bangladesh LCD status and Nahid Bano on the education. So these are only comments. I don't want you to address them. So the next person is Abdul Jabbar Saab. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Wonderful presentations. Thank you for that. My experience is very similar to Professor Sharif's. I got my education entirely from Indian education system, but I didn't work there. I came here 42 years ago. My question has been, recently I've been recruited to be part of committee, Tamil Nadu Education Improvement Committee or something like that. And then I'm trying to learn things. So your discussion, presentation really reveals a lot of factual realities. This is something I would like to present to the committee itself that I'm part of. So my question is, how much society-based responsibility? We try to put the blame on the footsteps of politicians. Politicians come from the society. So if you look at the post-colonial societies, India, I think it has done better. It can do well, I think, according to your analysis. But how much we had to really, you're looking at the environmental decay, river depletion, pollution, how much responsibility we had to assign to the society itself? Thank you.
Very briefly, when we say assign responsibility to society, society is not, some monolithic entity out there. Society is composed of a collection of many individuals and families. And in a way, I lay the blame there too, except that what I use the term social norms, the normative structure within which people act. The reason why society can be considered a culprit here is not because individuals are bad, because individuals are somehow exploitatively inclined. But when a sizable number of people begin to cheat, then it is optimal for me to cheat. If I feel that the other guy is going to take advantage of me, I prefer to have the opportunity to cheat him before he can cheat me. This is not a social, this is nothing to do with the social structure. This is to do with the incentives once you get into a bad equilibrium. For example, there is a paper by Robert Wade in 1982 on the canal irrigation systems in South India. And one of the engineers there says, if I am not corrupt, then I will be ostracized by my colleagues, because then I will be an impediment to the corruption around me. I will become the roadblock that prevents others from being corrupt. So when we use society, I don't like to think of this as something that is inherent in Indian society, something that is given, but it is a process by which once norms decay, they become a bad equilibrium from which it is very difficult to extricate the social system.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me see if there is any more, but I think.
Mr. Hussain, I would like to make a few points. I'm a senior fellow of the City Mayors Foundation, and I have been studying India, and I have relatives there. And I want to say, and also I've worked in public finance in the United States. So I understand both countries in a way. The one problem about India, and it is quite unique to India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, is the fact that they have in the urban and rural areas two reflections of two parts of two eras of British history. One era is the urban era is a system is from an older era, and the rural era, ironically, is from the more modern era of British history. And this is causing a problem because both parts of the local government system, urban and rural, are really incompatible with each other. And the urbanization that is taking place in India is taking place in the margins between the two systems. So India has to really devise solutions for that. And the first way to devise is to first understand what the problem is. And the problem is that the two systems are incompatible with each other, and you have to make them work. The other thing about is that, Mr. Mody, Professor Mody, America is soon going to have a huge problem, and this is because of the policy from the 1930s of ghettoizing the African Americans and the Mexican Americans by a policy called redlining, and the result is that America is soon going to be inherited by people who are not properly educated. Recent tests have shown that reading comprehension, American students are only proficient, up to 30% are proficient in reading comprehension. Some states already are becoming majority Hispanic.
Miss Mehraj, come please. This is only comment, or you wanted to ask a question?
Well, I have it's about India. I think I agree with you. I agree with you completely. And this is from my independent study of India. So, but the other thing is that we have to think about how to go about making these solutions. and about making things cheaper, and so that the manufacturing will increase. I'm wondering if that will happen, because I have seen Indian products in the American market and bypass them because they were not refined enough. So you now can get cheap products which are very well made. I don't think Indian manufacturers are investing in their factories to improve the quality of those products.
Okay. And
well, I don't really have very much to say, to the extent that America is going through similar problems. Yes, I agree. At a core level, America has had some of the same issues that I have described in India. In unregulated capitalism, which has been accompanied by very rapid growth in inequalities and a disregard for the provision of public goods. So that core structure operates in America just the same as in India, just that America being a much richer country, the depreciation is not as visible in the Indian case. It shows itself in very acute limitation of job creation and in much more precarious living conditions.
okay, great. 1 minute comment by Dr. Ravi Sinha, and then we. I always put you on the spot.
I have to congratulate Professor Mody. It was a wonderful presentation, and he in these times when there is a significant propaganda going on that India is doing great, after 800 or 1200 years of foreign rule, now Hindu rule has come back to India, and that is what India needed. It's good to know how India is broken. Professor Mody himself said that he has deliberately kept away from policy comparisons or causes behind why India is broken. But still, I would like to know if he can comment if any two large periods in independent India or any two prominent regimes can be compared with each other, number one. So temporal comparisons, for example, did Nehru do as badly as people are saying these days? Or it looks to me that given the country he had and the times he had, he did remarkably well compared to the claims being made now. And number two, the horizontal comparisons, democracy and autocracy apart on a consistent basis, starting from 1978, when China and India were in similar conditions, China has forged ahead. So what, for a layperson, was the main reason that China has done spectacularly well and is now challenging the biggest economic power on the planet, and India has done so poorly?
So the latter question is very easy to answer. China became member of the World Bank in 1981. And the World Bank sent what they call a mission, which is a team to China for its first assessment of China. The World Bank at that point knew very little about what was happening in China. This was their first opportunity to understand China. And this is a very fascinating report that was made public in 1983. It's a report that has a historical significance because this was the first detailed description of what had happened during the communist period in China. And it said, look, communism has created many casualties, but the communists have educated the kids, especially women. They've provided nearly universal health care. Children are well nourished, and women have an important part both in the economy and in society. For those of you who don't know this phrase, Mao Zedong often spoke of women with great respect, and he used the phrase, "Women hold up half the sky." And he practiced it. Women were members of the Communist Central Party, whatever that's called, the Communist Central Party Committee. Women were very active members of the labor force.
Politburo.
And while it is true that women in China still struggle for gender parity, and there is still a lot of discrimination, by far the Chinese women have done better than Indian women have done. So based on that analysis in 1981, the World Bank made a prediction that the bank and IMF rarely make. I was at the World Bank and IMF for 25 years. I've never seen a prediction like that. They said that based on the human capital that has emerged from the communist period, we predict that China will grow spectacularly over the next 20 years. A prediction that came 100% true. Remember that at that point, there was very little by way of the so-called liberalization, so-called opening up of free trade zones, all the stuff that has been celebrated since then. They were looking at the core fundamentals. The fundamentals have to be right. Unless those fundamentals are right, the policies like tweaking a tax rate or tweaking a tariff policy or creating incentives for this, that, and the other, they don't mean very much. And that was the message of the 1981 World Bank report. Therefore, China's superior performance relative to India and the Indian continuous sense of envy relative to China, that India will somehow supplant China, is bullshit, because we have still not got the fundamentals right. We still don't have those fundamentals right. And we think we can do it without on the cheap by some gee-whiz magic bullet in some payment system. The phrase that I heard most often when I was in India this time, was Paytm, UPI, electronic wallet. What does that have to do with development? What earthly purpose does that serve? How does it help you with the fact that हमारे बच्चों को पढ़ाई नहीं होती है, ये पढ़ाई नहीं होती है? How does that deal with those fundamentals? That's why, as you can see, even now, even in this small gathering, I'm getting emotional. But the problem is that we are trying always to duck the hard questions by seeking easy solutions. On the Nehru issue, let me just say very briefly, look, I'm a great admirer of Pandit Nehru. A man of very high idealism. But it is a fact, and to avoid this fact would be irresponsible. He neglected human development. He neglected both education and healthcare. Through the first three plans, this was the one major casualty. And for that, he has to be considered culpable. The current sort of disregard and disparagement of Nehru is for reasons that are completely orthogonal to the reasons why I am also critical of Nehru. I'm critical because he did not get the country started on a sound footing in these vital respects, despite the fact that he was himself a historian of great repute, despite the fact that Rabindranath Tagore, one of his mentors, had emphasized to him many times that this is the right path for India. He chose the path of heavy industrialization, which did not create jobs, which was not associated with human capital development, therefore set the country off on the wrong foot. That's a very different diagnosis from the current political dispensations, but it is nevertheless a critical diagnosis.
So thank you so much.
Somebody has just tweeted the IITs were built during Nehru's period. Correct. I am a product of the IITs. My wife is a product of the IITs. And we are benefiting. We are sitting over here having this discussion. I'm not saying that the IITs were not good. The question I'm asking is, for every one of us who went to an IIT, how many kids did not go to primary school? That is the question I'm asking.
Very good. Very good. So before I hand over to Razi Bhai, I'd like to thank you, Professor Mody, for excellent analysis, and Dr. Sharif and Shriana Bhattacharya. Back to you, Razi Bhai. Thank you so much, Professor Mody, to stay with us for more than 2 hours. It is a long time.
Yeah, he looks tired. He just came back from India, I guess 2 days back or less than 2 days back. So it must be jet lag and all those. Thank you so much. It was really very engaging and very matter-of-factly thing. You know, very rarely we get such kind of seminars or talks which go by data and the issues, real issues that India is facing. And I wish that we had more time to have some real prescription how to really, though you already prescribed many things that how things can be changed. But who is listening? Because you're not approaching the government anyway. You just said that you have not attempted, or probably they will not ask you to put on the, you know, if there is a prescription to change the course. But anyway, it was very well accepted. Your India is broken on so many ground, and it is really very depressing on many things. Though we think that India is growing very fast, India is growing fast, but in spite of that, there are so many broken lines. Thank you very much, Professor Mody, and we will certainly engage you again sometimes after a few months, because it was really very,
very interesting,
very well
thorough,
well researched, and so much. We are people of science, so we appreciate more, I think, in that sense, that it is database. Thank you so much. You must
thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for having me, and for all these wonderful questions that you've asked to keep me engaged. I really appreciate all your courtesy and your interest in listening to me.
Thank you.
Very enlightening.
And a YouTube, YouTube video will be released, I think, a week time, and it will.
Yeah. Many thanks. Okay. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
तो भाई रजी और रफत एक सवाल आप लोगों से कर सकता हूँ?
हाँ, सॉरी, आपका हाथ देखा, लेकिन
कोई बात नहीं,
मोदी जी
कोई बात
बहुत थके हुए थे भाई, अभी बेचारे 2 घंटे तक लगे रहे, and he just came back from Delhi.
चले, कोई पंजाबी में कहते हैं कोई गल नहीं है, लेकिन सवाल ये है कि हमारा बेचारा हमारा एक कमेंट ये था कि भाई जैसे इंडिया ब्रोकन है, काश पाकिस्तान भी इतना ही ब्रोकन हो। दूसरा,
यार आप लोग का मसला दूसरे टाइप का, आप लोग जो रियल इश्यू पे न जा करके इमोशनल मामले में पूरी तरह अपने कंट्री को झुलसाए हुए हैं।
दूसरा जो रियली एक जेलसी थी, एक फीलिंग ऑफ हर्ट है कि यार एक जमाना था जब इकोनॉमी की बात होती थी तो पाकिस्तान एंड इंडिया यूज्ड टू बी टॉक्ड इन द सेम सेंटेंस, यूज्ड टू बी मेंशन्ड। अब हमारा पाकिस्तान बेचारे का जिक्र भी नहीं होता यार, वो बांग्लादेश का जिक्र करके निकल गए, हमारा नाम तक नहीं किया।
तो उसके रीजन है ना, देखिए जिस पीरियड की आप बात कर रहे हैं वो अर्ली पीरियड था, वेरी अर्ली पीरियड ऑफ पाकिस्तान एग्जिस्टेंस। उस टाइम तो इंडिया की कोई इकोनॉमी भी नहीं थी, कुछ नहीं थी। बाद में जब लेटर फूटर में इतना ग्रो हुआ तो उसमें पाकिस्तान वहीं का वहीं था, बाकी सारे आगे बढ़ गए। तो ये इशू
Anyway, yeah, that's another discussion.
दुखी है भाई, दुखी है हम
भी। रजी साहब जी, रजी साहब, हम भी तुम जैसे ही निकले रिसाइट करना चाहिए।
कुछ चीजों में तो है, हम भी तुम जैसे। वो फहमीदा रियाज की जो वो थी,
बड़ा फहमीदार है।
हाँ कि भाई हम तो तुमको समझा रहे थे, तुम भी वैसे ही निकल ले रहे हो यार, ये बात ठीक नहीं। ये तो मोदी जी को कोई समझाए, तो अब हम लोग तो समझे हुए हैं भाई। रुद्रांशु, you are so passive now today. What happened to you? You are not biting us in that sense.
No, Razi bhai, his talk was so great.
Oh, really,
It
no
was
doubt about
on my mindset, unlike yours, because you prefer to see the better side. I prefer to see.
Sir,
No, it's not better.
Yeah, but
Program-
it was a talk of my kind where you analyze the
प्रोग्राम आपका है सर, तो मैं डिसिप्लिन की किसी लाइन की ब्रेक नहीं करना चाहता हूँ।
अरे क्या बात है, आज कुछ ज्यादा जो है।
लेकिन अभी पाकिस्तान के एक साहब कह रहे थे कि साहब आई एम वेरी डिप्रेस्ड और मैं बड़ा निराश हूँ, तो मैं उनसे कहना चाहता हूँ कि आप भगवान से मनाइए, कुदरत से मनाइए कि मोदी साहब टिके रहे हिंदुस्तान में, तो वी विल सून बिकम पाकिस्तान। There is no need to
ये कौन सी दुआ है यार, ऐसी दुआ
यार ये वाली बात तो बहुत लोग कह रहे हैं।
तो
वैसे ये
in
all seriousness रुद्रांशु जी, जो मोदी साहब कर रहे हैं, ये मूवी हम पाकिस्तान में 80s में देख चुके हैं, जहाँ रिलीजन को
सही बात है
इतना ज्यादा इस्तेमाल किया गया political
Modi is doing to India what Zia-ul-Haq did to Pakistan.
तो इसीलिए तो कहा जा रहा है कि वहां से लेसन सीखने के बजाय रिवर्स गियर में आप जा रहे हैं, और वहां से लोग समझा रहे थे कि मत करो वो जो हम कर चुके हैं।
जी
वहां से कर, अब वो इसमें कोई शुबा नहीं कि दे हैव द सेम पोटेंशियल, बट व्हेन यू रप्चर द सोसाइटी on those grounds, it becomes a problem. So, तो इल्तफा साहब, आप जो है घबराए नहीं, कुछ दिनों बाद आपके यहाँ भी ठीक हो जाएगा, कोई बात नहीं। और आप तो वैसे भी न्यू जर्सी में हैं, थोड़ा यहीं से वार का ठीक कीजिए। NRIs को ज्यादा है प्रॉब्लम असल में, जो हम लोग यहाँ बैठ करके वहां का सोचते हैं तो ज्यादा है प्रॉब्लम।
He had a courage, at least, to title the book India is broken. It's a very bold statement.
वो करेज में
Very bold.
वो क्या प्रॉब्लम था करेज दिखाने में? He is right here and he is always
Even with that, you are on the target.
Oh, well,
Yes, unbelievable.
There are so many on target.
Nobody is talking about.
रवि सिन्हा साहब भी टारगेट पे है, कोई बात नहीं।
I mean, to say something and to put in a print is totally different thing. And it's everyone is talking about India. The fourth largest economy is going to be third, is going to be second. And in the meantime, you talk about, oh my God, India is broken. So somebody
he's talking on economy. So there is no politics in that. So nobody can challenge.
It doesn't matter if politics, everything is so intermingled. You can't separate politics from economy.
Raji Sahab, India is even more broken politically.
Well, yeah, लेकिन मतलब कहने का मतलब कि इन्होंने पॉलिटिक्स नहीं टच की तो ज्यादा आपको हाउंड किया जा सकता है, because that is more ये जो इकोनॉमी वाला मामला है इसको लोग इग्नोर कर जाते हैं।
Razi bhai, whenever you touch education and economy, politics automatically comes in because the government set those policies. As he said, there is no country in the world where the education is 100% private. You cannot run the education without the government.
Sure.
So that's why. So automatically government is there.
अभी सुन ले तो मनोजी साहब कहाँ हैं? Where are you?
I'm here. I'm very much.
Please don't be so shy.
No, I'm not being shy. You see, I thought we were starting at the usual time, but we started 1 hour early, so I missed it.
Oh, that's right. Okay, can you?
But I put a comment in there. I think he was a little bit negative about what happened in the Nehru period, and indeed, what people today don't realize is that the growth rate, these phenomenal numbers that we've been seeing in the last 15, 20 years, They were themselves the product of a savings policy that was initiated in the early planning period. If we had not built the IITs, if we had not built Bhilai Steel, etc., built that infrastructure behind the protective wall, this whole liberalization project would have died stillborn. Yeah. So I think the question in my mind always was, when is the right time to start the liberalization project? And probably we did start at the right time. The infrastructure had been built. We did have steel, we did have coal, we did have power. Sure. So we were able to do that. Now, the question is, could we also have done education on a grand scale at the same time? So the question I want to ask, people is, how long did it take? Somebody else has put it here. I can't remember now. I think, yes, it's Abdul Jabbar put it in that we have to look at the time zone, time frame that, America has had 250 years of independence. We've had 75 years. So when did universal free education in schools, public education in schools start in America?
Yeah, true. If you go by that, so in 70 plus years, we did many things very well,
exactly.
But very difficult to really put everything in order within such a short time.
It is a very short time. So we have to undo 5,000 years of history in 75 years. This is too much.
I kind of agree, but compare with other countries, you are younger than India.
But look at the country's size also, and the
enormity
of the problem.
That excuse is always there, and I really don't agree with that. Because you have a manpower, you have a big.
But the countries which took off, the East Asian tigers, they're an interesting group of countries. They do have certain commonalities which we don't have. They're very homogeneous, their common language, all of those things which we don't have. But they did exceptionally well in the 60s and 70s, but with a lot of state intervention. So it was not kind of unfettered capitalism. They had a lot of state intervention, state support for certain industries, et cetera, et cetera. And they do have universal free education. We also have universal free education, but the quality is terrible. But, when did that start? You have to compare it with, when did countries and corruption also, all countries have gone through a period of very heavy corruption. It's not as if there isn't corruption in the US, but because it's rich, the corruption takes place, the numbers involved are huge. People are not corrupt for $10. They're corrupt for $10 million.
They count on millions.
Why you are not showing yourself, number one?
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize that oh God, I never even saw that. Okay.
Who?
There we are. Okay. Yeah. So I think we have to, as he was speaking, I was thinking about, one of the most corrupt societies in the world was Elizabethan England. Everybody was taking bribes. If you bribed, and you made a mistake and did the wrong bribe, you lost your head. A lot of people were executed. Now that was roughly the same time as Akbar the Great. Were we more or less corrupt in India than England was at the same time? I'm not at all persuaded that it's a national characteristic for Appa to be corrupt.
Now, in the present time, you are there. How corrupt England really is now?
Less. I mean, obviously less, but that's because where Britain has been successful, more successful than almost any other country, is in building institutions, so that the power of an individual is very, very limited, and that is what has prevented corruption. And for example, the head of the London Metropolitan Police Force, Scotland Yard, was found guilty of racist behavior. She was sacked immediately. Now, I can't imagine this happening in many countries.
We have made progress, Razi Bhai, even on that, from a country that used to be corrupt for $10. Now we have managed to become corrupt for $10 billion or something like that.
Exactly. So that's progress of a kind.
Say that. So you all have to see also from this angle that India, when we got freedom, look at the societies, how much poverty was there, how much divisions were there. There was no infrastructure, everything was just nothing. And now everything has to be built up. So that you have to prioritize what